The day after the interview's broadcast, Arpad Pustai was fired and the research team dismantled. Dr. Stanley Ewan was in charge of evaluating the impact of GM potatoes on the rat's internal organs. He no longer has any illusions about scientific independence.
I was extremely, angry and very, very concerned. It's like your whole world is disappearing under your feet. What's going on?
But you see, they start to discredit Stanley as well. It's not just Arpad and me. Stanley was made to retire and he was discredited at the university.
As well?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
It was very hard indeed.
Monday, it was wonderful work. Tuesday, it was rubbished. I had one or two ideas of what was happening, but a very imprecise idea until 8 years ago, almost exactly, I was at a dinner dance. And next to me at the top table was someone from the road called Dutteroy, who happened to say, I said, isn't it awful what's happening to Arpad? Yes, he said, and did you not know that there were not one, but 2 phone calls from Downing Street to the director? And then, of course, I saw clearly what was happening, that this was something sort of supranational, if you like, some pressure being put on Tony Blair's office to stop this work because it was perceived by the Americans to be harming their industrial base, the biotech industry, in other words.
The Arpad Pustai scandal triggered a massive rejection of GMOs in Great Britain, led by Greenpeace. A year later, Robert Shapiro, Monsanto's CEO at the time, agreed to participate in a teleconference organized by the environmental organization. This is the only existing video footage of the former CEO. He was responsible for moving the company into the biotechnology era with its new slogan, Food, Health and Hope.
Monsanto made huge efforts to push its products in every direction with the full support of multinational food manufacturers, retailers, communications firms, regulators, even governments. You behave not as a company offering life and hope, but as bullies, trying to force your products on us.
If I'm a bully, I don't feel that I'm a very successful bully. I want to start by emphasizing that biotechnology is a tool. Biotechnology in itself is neither good nor bad. It can be used well or it can be used badly. The products that are on the market have been reviewed through the regulatory processes that society has established in order to assure not only safety, but the environmental safety of the products themselves.
After 10 years on the market, Roundup Ready soybeans account for 90% of all the soybeans grown in the U.S. In fact, 70% of the food in American stores contains bioengineered elements. Unlike Europe, consumers cannot make an informed decision because GM labeling is forbidden, a direct consequence of the principle of substantial equivalence.
You know, I've got a soybean in my hand here, and I can eat this soybean. It's very safe, very safe.
I think FDA is confident that the soybean, in terms of food safety, is as safe as other varieties of soybean.
How is the FDA confident about that?
It's based on all the data that the company provided to FDA that was reviewed by FDA scientists. And so it's not in the company's interest to try to design a study in some way that would mask results.
How can James Mariansky be so sure? If I type in Monsanto falsified scientific studies, I get 174,000 hits. Among them, a report from the EPA of the United States. Monsanto accused of falsifying studies concerning the carcinogenicity of dioxin. The story began in Nitro, in a Monsanto factory that produced a powerful herbicide called 2,4,5-T. In 1949, an explosion in the factory provoked unexpected side effects. 228 workers developed an extremely disfiguring illness called chloracne. It's caused by dioxin, which is a highly toxic byproduct of 2,4,5-T. T was the main ingredient in Agent Orange, the defoliant used by the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War. During the war, 40 million liters of Agent Orange, containing 400 kilograms of pure dioxin, were sprayed on trees in southern Vietnam. 3 million people were contaminated, including thousands of American soldiers. Even some 40 years after the end of the war, dioxin continues to claim more victims. We know today that this poison provokes cancer and serious genetic malfunctions. In 1978, while American Vietnam veterans were suing the makers of Agent Orange, Monsanto sponsored studies on the long-term effects of dioxin. The company paid scientists to compare the health of workers who had been exposed during the nitro plant's accident 30 years prior to the health of non-exposed workers. There are two experts on the subject. William Sanjour, who led the Toxic Waste Division of the Environmental Protection Agency, and Gerson Smoger, a lawyer who represents Vietnam veterans.
In 1990, Dr. Kate Jenkins, a colleague of mine at EPA, wrote a memorandum pointing out that allegations had been made that those studies, some of those studies that Monsanto had conducted were flawed. And if they were done correctly, would have reached just the opposite result that Monsanto had. The Monsanto studies showed that dioxin was not a human carcinogen.
That means they had the data first, and then they manipulated how they were going to look at that data to come up with the conclusion they want. It's absolutely, you never do a study that way. Never. And they did it absolutely wrong, and they achieved what they wanted. And it came out later that there were people that had cancer that in one of the two studies were listed as being exposed to dioxin. And the same 5 people in another study were listed as not being exposed. When you put all these cancers into the unexposed, then it looked like the unexposed people were getting as much cancer as the exposed. And they said, look, there's no difference. See, they're the same.
So then thousands of veterans were disallowed benefits because of exposure to Agent Orange.
So all policy was affected by those studies for 7 to 9 years in this country.
Being a good scientist and a good EPA employee, and someone, by the way, who was quite fearless, Kate Jenkins wrote a memorandum to the EPA Science Advisory Board asking them to review these 2 studies to see if they were correctly done. The fact is, there was no investigation of Monsanto. It didn't exist. Nobody investigated those studies. Nobody, period. What they investigated was Kate Jenkins, the whistleblower. They made her life a hell. They harassed her. They changed her jobs. They persecuted the poor woman.
If you think of Monsanto today, they're telling that their GMOs, for instance, are sound and safe. Do you trust
I wouldn't
the
believe
company?
a word that company says. Nothing. I might trust some independent source who investigated their claims, depending on who that independent source was and how good they are and how independent they are.
Precisely. In order to prove the safety of Roundup-Ready soybeans, Monsanto carried out a study which was published in 1996 in a well-respected scientific journal. The study was supposed to assess the effects of GM soybeans on animal health, specifically on rats. This study was thoroughly reviewed by both a Danish scientist, now deceased, and the Norwegian specialist Ian Prime.
I'm afraid to say, value this study very poorly indeed. It's very disappointing, very disappointing. Especially because this paper sort of served as a basis for the whole principle of substantial equivalence. I can just cite, which is again a bit surprising, although the animal feeding studies provide some reassurance that no major changes occurred. Now, some reassurance, now that's not good enough. I want 100% reassurance, not just some reassurance. They talk, for example, about the, on page 723, except for the darker brown colour, livers appeared normal at necropsy. I mean, you can't do that without looking inside. You have to look at the content inside the liver, taking sections, showing under the microscope that there is no difference. They've used, for example, older rats. Obviously, again, if you want to avoid any problems, okay, use an adult. But if you want to see if any changes are evident, then you should use younger individuals. Of course. In some ways, you can say it's bad science because a lot of the data that they should have shown isn't shown.
But did you try, for instance, to get access to the raw data?
I didn't. A colleague of mine did, and spent quite a frustrating length of time going through different offices and so on. But finally, the answer was the answer was no. If there was nothing to hide, then there should be no problem. You should be willing to distribute your material for anybody to work on. And when you keep it tight, then you suspect that there's why is this the case?
One thing is sure. Thanks to this limited study, Monsanto's GMOs have inundated the world, principally in North and South America, Asia, and Australia. After only 10 years, transgenic crops now cover 250 million acres. 70% are Roundup resistant, and 30% have been genetically modified to produce an insecticide called Bt. Since 2001, the company has published a yearly document titled The Pledge Report, a kind of ethics statement in which Monsanto tries to justify its business practices. At the heart of the opposition to GMOs is the subject of patents. This is what Monsanto calls their intellectual property, which are supposed to protect their investment. In North America, every farmer who buys bioengineered seeds must sign a technology agreement in which the farmer promises to respect the company's patent on the modified gene.
Biotech crops are protected by U.S. patent law, and so I may not